I'd like to say, first of all, how delighted and honoured I am to be here today in such marvellous and distinguished company. And I'd like to express my gratitude to John Schneider for, first of all, the invitation to come speak to you this afternoon, and also for making the whole day happen. So I think John has done a fantastic job. Many of you here were, I'm sure, as amused as I was when, in 1997, Woody Allen released a movie with the title Reconstructing Harry. Of course, he didn't mean our Harry, but by changing only one letter, that would have made an ideal title for my book. I wish I'd thought of it before. For the work I did for the 10 years or so preceding the book's publication in 1998 might be described as a process of reconstructing Harry. During those years, I made it my business to unearth everything I could get my hands on the man that I considered then, and still consider today, to be one of America's greatest artists, and about whom, when I began my research in earnest in 1987, so little had still been written. Even the facts of his life were then only sketchily known to the musical world at large. What I thought to do this afternoon is, in a way, to reopen parts of the process of reconstructing Harry, and to share with you my thoughts about some current issues, current mysteries, dilemmas in Partch's biography, including some of those areas that I feel are not yet satisfactorily settled, and about which further research and reflection is needed. For despite the best efforts of those scholars who worked on Partch issues in recent years, and there are several of us, myself included, there remain not a few puzzling things about Harry Partch's life, issues that may never be resolved satisfactorily, but I thought it might be fun to share some of those with you this afternoon. Biography is a curious thing. The English biographer, Richard Holmes, called it a love match between invention and truth. In England, and I think the same is true in the United States, it is both despised and adored. Despised inasmuch as every biography is an intrusion into a private world, the inner life of an artist or celebrity. It therefore raises ethical questions about how justified we are in making public things about a person that they themselves would probably have rather left unsaid, but are prevented by death from objecting to. My countryman James Joyce, in a memorable passage from Finnegan's Wake, describes the conniving, privacy-invading biographer as the biographiend. And the 18th century English writer, Dr. Arbuthnot, remarked that biography has added a new terror to dying. But occasionally, the artist gets his or her own back. Some of you might recall the legal battle some years ago, when the reclusive and still very much living novelist J.D. Salinger took his British biographer, Ian Hamilton, through the courts and successfully impeded publication of Hamilton's would-have-been biography of him on the grounds that his publication would constitute an invasion of Salinger's much-coveted privacy. But whatever the objections to it, biography is adored at the same time by the reading public as being a lively genre, engaging, gripping. Real lives are often more incredible than fictional ones. And certainly, no novelist could have invented a character like Harry Partch. You'll not be surprised to learn that Harry had some pertinent things to say about biography. One day, many years ago, I was working through a box of papers that Daniel Mitchell had in San Diego, and you can imagine my consternation on finding a memo scribbled in Partch's most aggressive handwriting that said, quote, "Biography, it is so trivial. The larger world is trivial beyond belief. So let us be less trivial than that larger world," unquote. It really felt like he'd written that just for me, Bob, to discover many years after his death, politely but firmly telling me to leave him alone and get a life. Then there's the marvellous passage in the preface to the second edition of his book, Genesis of Music, in which he's talking about the path-breaking step taken by the individualist creative artist. And he says, in a memorable phrase, that the individual's path cannot be retraced, for each of us is an original being. I love that idea. It's true, it's beautifully expressed. But in a sense, what I did was precisely what he warned me was impossible. I decided to retrace his path. I suppose part of me read that statement as a deliberate provocation or challenge. His proclamation, "You cannot retrace my path," felt like an enticement to try. For the biographer, such a statement really throws down the gauntlet. Certainly, as biographical subjects go, Harry was, as he might have said, no serving of tapioca. Several periods of his life have left only the patchiest of documentation. Much of his childhood, his 20s, and not surprisingly perhaps, his hobo years in the later 1930s. To give you some idea of the problem of sources, consider that the earliest surviving letter written by Harry Partch, to the best of my knowledge, dates from 1931, when he was already 30 years old. When, during the preliminary research for the film The Dreamer That Remains in 1972, Stephen Coolio asked Partch if anyone had ever written a biography of him, and Partch replied, quite straightforwardly, "No, that would take a foundation grant." I believe that he cared desperately that his work be remembered, but I also believe that he would have accepted the claim that I make on the first page of my book, that while not in any sense explaining his work, an account of his life sheds light on how and why his output developed and took the form that it did. I would even argue further than that Partch consciously thought about posterity and cared about it, perhaps from quite early on, arguably, maybe even from the time of bitter music in the mid-1930s. His letters, for example, are always carefully dated. Quite a few of them, and some people have made this comment before me, give the sense of going on record, of being written with an eye to being read after he himself was long gone. His music manuscripts are likewise always carefully dated, usually with precise indications of place, starting date, completion date of composition, so that as musicologists we're in the unusual and luxurious position of having no areas of doubt about when a piece was written or revised. This is not, I would suggest, the behaviour of a man who was unconcerned about posterity. And he did, after all, give us parts of an autobiography. He didn't ever write his memoirs as such, but you may be interested to know that Lou Harrison suggested the idea to him late in Partch's life. And Partch replied that many of his early memories, especially of his childhood, were painful ones, so that he simply couldn't face it. But he gave us parts of an autobiography. The journal Bitter Music, the other little journal End Literal, the record of a hiking trip that we saw some of the drawings of in Philip's slides, US Highball, the passages recalling his childhood in the preface to the second edition of Genesis of Music, The Dreamer That Remains. All of these works and more document and bring alive the chapters from his life. In my book on him, I suggested that it's even possible to see Genesis of the Music partly as a sort of intellectual autobiography, an account of the musical and theoretical trail he'd followed since the 1920s. In another sense, you could argue that nearly everything he did was autobiographical. The lonely wanderers who crop up time and again in his work. Think of Lipo, the anonymous graffiti scribblers of Barstow, Mac in US Highball, Ulysses in Ulysses at the Edge, the son in search of his father's face, and the deaf hobo in Delusion of the Fury, the voice in the plastic bubble in The Dreamer That Remains. Surely these are all, to a greater or lesser extent, reinventions of Partch himself. Philip Blackburn has even speculated in the notes at the end of Enclosure 3 that there may have been a measure of self-identification with some of the characters in Partch's dramatic works, such as Oedipus, Tiresias, or The Witch in Bewitched. And Daniel Mitchell has emphasized the close identification Partch felt with the character of Sunny and the king Pentheus in Revelation in the Courthouse Park. The other way of saying this, and again I'm not the first to have said it, is that it is so difficult to separate out Partch's life from his work. They seem so inextricably one. The architect Bruce Goff wrote to him after their first meeting in 1956, quote, "I had the feeling we were old friends, although we had just met. Perhaps this is because you were so like your music, and it is so of you," unquote. In this sense, Partch's life and the life of his work tell one and the same story. One of the rewarding things about becoming an author is that you get to read reviews of your book, which can be, depending on your point of view, a harrowing or an amusing pursuit. But I discovered that it can even be instructive, occasionally. And in particular, I noted with some surprise that several of the reviewers who wrote about my book, and I picked up the same in reviews of Phillips' Enclosure 3, complimented me for doing one thing that I didn't in fact realize I'd done, and for which therefore no compliment seemed entirely deserved. It was for having, as one of them put it, quote, "exploded many of the myths Partch had created in sculpting his image for the world," unquote. I read this in the review and I thought, well, have I really done this? This wasn't my intention. And the more I thought about the reviewer's comments, that I had exploded many of the myths Partch had created in sculpting his image for the world, the less I agreed with it. And I don't agree with the implicit assumption. The assumption seems to be that Harry Partch mythologized his own life, creating a distorted but more glamorous version of his life's events, and conveniently airbrushing the less desirable details out of the picture. The job of the biographer, the one for which I received such undeserved praise, would then be to strip away all these willful falsifications and reveal the true man beneath the mask. A willful perpetrator of myths is not how I see Harry Partch, and an exploder of myths is not really how I regard the role of the biographer. But as we all know, sometimes wrong ideas can actually prove to be as useful as right ones. And the reviewer's comment got me thinking about these supposed Partch myths, what they were, how they arose, and about Partch's own role in the process, if indeed he played one. So I thought I'd share some of these thoughts with you now as a way of showing you some of the stages in reconstructing Harry, and look in particular at the subject about how much of what we know about Harry Partch has been sculpted by the man himself. Perhaps the most prevalent of these myths is the idea that Partch and his work sprang out of nowhere, that he was a sort of cultural desert plant, a self-made, self-taught genius, owing nothing to any teacher or educational institution. This myth has been perpetuated by a number of the journalistic sources on Partch, as well as by some historians of American music who want to know better. One, whom I'll leave unnamed for now, in his book Modern American Music, writes, quote, "As a musician, Partch was, as they say, a natural, self-taught and independent," unquote. And this idea is supposedly one that my biography demolishes. Well, let's explore this a little. In chapter 2 of my book, I indeed outline in some detail the quirky history of Partch's formal musical education, which is slightly more extensive than we perhaps might imagine or sometimes remember. He studied twice, as Philip mentioned, for brief periods in the early 1920s at the University of Southern California, where he took piano lessons with the then well-known pianist August Steeb. And he also studied briefly at the Kansas City Conservatory of Music. He studied harmony as well as piano, but not, as far as we know, composition as such. So, how does this square with the image of Partch as a self-taught, natural genius? In one sense, not very well. But my point is that this image of Partch, let's call it the cultural desert plant myth, is a fabricated one to begin with, and arose not from any distortions or falsifications on the part of Partch himself, but from the previously sparse knowledge of the sheer facts of this part of his life. To demonstrate this point, listen to how he responds to a question about his early musical development in this extract from a marvelous interview he did with Stubbs Terkel in Chicago in March 1962. In this extract, Terkel asks him, first of all, if he has had an academic musical background.
You're obviously not a traditional composer or maker of instruments. Have you had an academic musical background?
Oh, almost none, I would say. I was brought up in the Arizona and New Mexico deserts, and I was always interested in instruments. My mother and father and brother ordered instruments from mail order catalogs, but they were either too busy or they tired of them to continue. And I was the one who took them seriously, and so I played a mandolin and harmonica, of course, and a reed organ and a few things like that when I was very young. And I continued the music. I never stopped.
But self-trained?
Almost entirely, yes. Well, later on, I did have piano lessons and some violin lessons. I think I entered University of Southern California School of Music for about a month with the Kansas City Conservatory, but I wasn't built for academic inculcation.
Now, for the biographer, someone such as myself, recorded interview material like this is pure gold dust. First of all, there isn't very much of it in Partch's case, relatively speaking. There's quite a bit less than if you take an equally well-known figure such as John Cage or maybe living people like Steve Reich or Philip Glass, where you're inundated with recorded interview material with those people. With Partch, it's not quite the case, and almost all of those tapes come from late in his life. Anyway, I find it fascinating on listening to that recording, and I listened to that many times when I was writing my book, to follow the somewhat unusual train of Partch's thought and to see how he answers the question about his early musical education. After first replying that no, he had almost no academic musical background, he goes on to talk about his lonely childhood in the Southwest and about the instruments he played, the mail order instruments, as a boy, which seems like an answer to a slightly different question. Turkle then asks the same thing for a second time, and gets a similar initial response. If you remember, Partch saying that he was almost entirely self-trained, but that later he had piano and violin lessons and studied briefly at the University of Southern California and at the Kansas City Conservatory. In other words, he interprets Turkle's question to mean, were you musically trained from an early age? To which his truthful answer is no. In this respect, he was almost entirely self-taught. Hence, there is absolutely no concealment or myth-making in his answer. In some of his written discussions of the same subject, Partch emphasizes that most of his important musical discoveries came from lonely hours browsing in public libraries and not from his teachers. Again, all of that is true. But he does not deny that he had teachers, nor does he himself claim to have been any sort of cultural desert plant who sprang from nowhere. A second myth that my book is supposed to have exploded likewise rests on a misconception, as the previous one does. It concerns the image of Harry Partch as a hobo composer. This one is really very simple. If you follow the chronology of this part of his life, as I give it in chapter 4 of my book, you'll see that when he was a hobo, he wasn't doing any composing. And when he was composing, he wasn't living as a hobo. Even Bitter Music, which is the record of his hobo travels in 1935 and 1936, Partch himself tells us that Bitter Music was put into shape using the homes and pianos of friends in Glendale, La Crescenta, and Covina when he was taking a temporary respite from his hobo existence. The only completed composition from that traumatic and difficult period of his life is Barstow, written in a few weeks of relative peace and stability in La Mesa and completed at Anderson Creek. U.S. Highball was in fact composed in a room in Ithaca, New York, when he was working at a bookkeeping job for a small scrap iron company, some 18 months after the hobo trip it describes. Again, my point is much the same. These misconceptions are not the doing of Partch himself, who is straightforward and truthful on such matters. They arise from an unthinking kind of journalistic excess, from writers, and sometimes quite well-meaning ones, who like this image of the hobo composer and the romantic but wholly imaginary picture that it evokes. And after all, music manuscript paper is not usually in ready supply in freight trains. I could continue this list of misconceptions and myths indefinitely. There are many of them. But I feel that such things are only interesting up to a certain point. Partch's life story has plenty of genuinely puzzling aspects, those shady areas about which we've relatively little information, and hence all kinds of fascinating questions pose themselves about his intentions and motivations. questions about his life still fascinate me 3 years after the publication of my book, and I find them much more interesting than the mistaken or misleading notions that still crop up from time to time about him. I'd like to talk now about one mystery that I feel I solved, and then about two others that I feel I haven't solved. In these latter two cases, I invite all of you to enter the discussion. First, though, to one of my little success stories. Again, this relates to Partch's early years here, and particularly to his periods of study in the Los Angeles area at the beginning of the 1920s. And specifically, it has to do with the role that his mother played in pushing her son in the direction of a musical career. This afternoon, we've already made the brief acquaintance of Partch's mother, Jenny Childers Partch, and those of you who've read my book, or Philip's Enclosure 3, will already know her in some detail. She was, by all accounts, a formidable woman. Today, we describe her as a social rights activist, a campaigner for women's rights. She was a newspaper journalist, a Christian Scientist, and by her younger son's accounts, a domineering mother. She encouraged the young Harry's early musical aptitudes. She taught him to read music, and after the death of her husband in 1919, she seemed determined to oversee Harry's development. Listen to how he talks about her in this extract from an interview that he did with Vivian Purvis in March 1974, only a few months before his death. The quality on this is not fantastic, but have a close listen therefore to what he's saying. It's rather fascinating also to hear his tone of voice. They're talking about the time when he sets out on his own musical path around 1930 and turns his back on the traditions of concert music.
Most people are afraid to cut loose from the past.
Well, I am. I've given up the piano totally, which I had treasured and of course I was still young, but I had no family, I had no wife, and so I had all myself to be decided. My parents died before I was 20, so there was no home. I had nothing. And in a sense that was good. Because if I had a mother who was remember if I get someplace, well, she would have been if she'd been alive, because that was her purpose in life, that I had to run to something.
For those of you who didn't quite catch what he said at the end, he says, my parents died before I was 20, so there was no home. I had nothing. And in a sense, that was good. Because if I had had a mother who was demanding that I get someplace, which she would have been if she'd been alive, because that was her purpose in life, that I had to amount to something. Early on in my research, when Natalie Mitchell let me hear this tape, I formed the theory, the fairly plausible theory, that it was Harry's mother who pushed him in the direction of formal musical education, perhaps against his wishes, or at least against his inclinations and instincts. He tells us in Genesis of the Music that when he left high school in 1919, his mind was already filled with, quote, doubts and ideas, unquote. And as you heard him telling Studs Terkel a little earlier, he probably sensed even then that he wasn't built for academic inculcation. However, he had been a good student at high school, he had good grades, and the idea of further study at university or conservatory surely appealed to his mother, who herself had then just recently completed a degree at the University of New Mexico. But this matter was settled, I hope conclusively, by some documents that turned up in the archives of the University of Southern California. The chronology, in fact, runs like this. Harry moved to Los Angeles, as far as we know, in the fall of 1919. His mother joined him there probably a few months later. However, his mother died, in fact was killed, as Philip mentioned, in a streetcar accident in November 1920, which meant that both his parents were then gone. But in the dusty old USC School of Music ledgers that I turned up in the course of my research, we find Harry Partch's name inscribed quite clearly 3 times. First in February 1921, then June 1922, and again for the summer session in 1922. That makes it quite clear that his enrollment at USC was his own decision. It was after his mother had gone. Of course, it may have been motivated by some form of urge to honor his mother's wishes. That we can't say. But in any case, none of his periods of formal study lasted very long. On this matter, then, a measure of biographical detective work paid off and clarified at least one of the mysteries of Harry Partch's early life. But I want to end my talk this afternoon with two unsolved mysteries, which still fascinate me. They're perhaps somewhat specialist in nature, so let's just think of them as curio items for the Harry Partch connoisseur. The first relates to a comment that I made in one of the footnotes in chapter 3 of my book, and it's something I still think about, although admittedly without any real progress to speak of. It concerns the auto-da-fé, Partch's burning in a big iron stove, of the manuscripts of all of the music he composed in his youth, some 16 years worth, allegedly an incident that took place in New Orleans in 1930. Let me play you first of all Partch's famous account of that incident. Some of you may have heard this on the Columbia bonus record that used to come with Delusion and Fury. And he's talking about the completion of the adapted viola in 1930 and then about his decision to burn all of his music to that point.
The adapted viola was begun in Santa Rosa in 1928 and finished in New Orleans in 1930. And after it was finished, I destroyed some 16 years of previous work in a big pot-bellied stove, and I called it an auto-da-fé, and with those flames came a great new freedom.
Partch was always clear that the burning of his early compositions was of tremendous symbolic importance to him. And he speaks of it as an act of purification, a ritualistic act of purging by fire. However, in the document that he left us, there is a puzzling, and in his case, totally uncharacteristic, vagueness about the date of this auto-da-fé. All his life, he claimed to be able to relive the great surge of freedom that swept through him on that occasion. And this precisely remembered image of the big pot-bellied iron stove in which the manuscripts were burned lent the memory a touch of authenticating vividness. Yet among his later accounts, we find datings as much as 4 years apart. In one document, prepared for the University of Wisconsin in the 40s, and the earliest of his accounts that we still have, he gives the date as 1926, which replaced the event several years before his arrival in New Orleans. That immediately poses a small question mark. Of course, maybe there's no real contradiction. Perhaps he burned some pieces in 1926, which he claims that he did, and the rest, perhaps the vast majority, in New Orleans in 1930. But already things are seeming a little bit less clear. Let's think this through a little further. In his descriptions of the auto-da-fé, Partch is adamant that he burned absolutely all of his music. And if so, that would imply two things. First, that he kept all of his manuscripts, even the earliest juvenilia he composed in Albuquerque, together in one relatively tidy pile so that he could put his hands on all of it at once. Now, this is, of course, possible, but it's very much at odds with his later habits. Those of you in this room who knew Partch well will remember, in fact several of you have told me, that he could be very careless about the filing of his papers and would lose or misplace things fairly often, even scores or parts. Second, it would imply that all of his manuscripts either accompanied him to New Orleans or were forwarded shortly after his arrival. He's unlikely to have brought them on board the oil tanker that he worked on just before that. So we must assume that a trunkload of his papers and books that had remained intact during his wanderings in the later 1920s was forwarded to him. Now, of course, none of this is impossible, but I would suggest that there's a sufficient degree of unlikelihood about some of those details, which means that we cannot rule out the tantalizing possibility that some manuscripts or copies or scraps of his early pre-1930 music escaped the auto-da-fé, simply because they weren't part of the bundle of papers he had with him in New Orleans. We have absolutely none of his music at all, apart from one little published song, which we'll hear in the concert tonight, but wouldn't we all love to hear some more? So that's my suggestion. We can't rule out the fact that some of it is actually still out there. The second of my still live biographical mysteries for the Harry Partch connoisseur may seem like an apparently simple detail, but it's one that I still think about because it hints at larger questions. It concerns one of the letters to Partch from the Irish poet W.B. Yeats, whom, as you know, he met in Ireland in November 1934, a momentous occasion for the young Partch. The letter from Yeats in question, unfortunately, is not dated, but by various clues, we can say that it was almost certainly written in or around March 1935, while Partch was still in London pursuing research at the British Museum. Yeats had been ill that winter, and he wrote again to Partch, this was I think the third letter he wrote to Partch, saying that he regretted not being able to come to London and to see Partch again before Partch left to go back to the States. And then Yeats' letter continues, quote, "I return your biographical essay, which I found exceedingly interesting. You have a narrative gift and a remarkable power of explaining yourself," unquote. While it's marvellous to have such praise from one of the 20th century's great men of letters for Partch's writing, it's frustrating to acknowledge that we simply do not know what this biographical essay that Yeats found exceedingly interesting was. First of all, there's an oddity. Surely Yeats can't mean biographical essay, because Partch did not, as far as we're aware, produce biographical material on anyone, although what a tantalizing idea. Surely Yeats must mean autobiographical, i.e. Partch writing about his own life. But what, by March 1935, could that autobiographical writing have been? Perhaps a product of his little trip to Italy or Malta, from which he had just returned? Anyhow, no such essay, biographical or autobiographical, from that period of his life has survived. Or has it? You may recall that there's a passage in Bitter Music, the entry for June 24th, 1935, Partch's 34th birthday, which in effect is a long flashback to his travels, studies, and experiences in Europe, and in fact amounts to a lengthy recap of the events of the previous year, from late June 34 to June 35, beginning with the moment that he receives notification of his Carnegie grant, through his months of waiting in New York, his passage to England, his arrival in London, his trip to Ireland to meet Yeats, his disappearance to Italy and Malta, his brief final weeks in London before returning to the US. It's quite a lengthy stretch, and I've often wondered about this flashback material and the strange way in which it punctuates Bitter Music at that point. My question is it possible that this material, this flashback material, or part of it, could have originated as a stand-alone piece, and that that is what he sent to Yeats? And that Yeats' high regard for it, said it's exceedingly interesting, persuaded Harry to incorporate it in Bitter Music. In that case, and I hasten to point out this is pure speculation on my part, we would, after all, have a record of W.B. Yeats' high praise for part of Bitter Music. A final twist, though, to this speculation. Suppose I'm right, and suppose Partch indeed produced an autobiographical essay about his experiences in Europe, which he sent to Yeats, who wrote so glowingly of it. Could Yeats's approval then have encouraged Partch to take a notebook with him when he took to the road in June 1935? In other words, have we got W.B. Yeats to thank for the encouragement that provided some of the motivation to write Bitter Music? As I say, unresolved mystery. In conclusion, then, let me return to the idea that I discussed earlier, that Harry Partch shaped the mythology of his own life, that he himself was one of the main players in the game of reconstructing Harry. I think the idea is nonsense. If he remains a semi-legendary figure today, and in some senses a mystery, even to those of you, unlike me, who knew him, this is, I would suggest, largely because of gaps or inconsistencies in the historical record, in the documents of his life, and not because, as some of my reviewers implied, Partch controlled, shaped, and doctored his own image, reinventing himself for the world and throwing a smokescreen in our faces. On the contrary, in talking and writing about his own life, he is scrupulously honest, even sometimes harrowingly so, an exemplary figure in the quest to be true to one's lived experience. The simple fact is that when I began research for my book in 1987, and that's only, 14 years ago, the longest available published chronology of Partch's life at that time was Ben Johnston's in the sleeve notes to the New World Records LP of Partch and Cage, and even that was only some 2,000 words long. In terms of published sources, this was superseded only as recently as 1991 with Tom McGeary's introduction to the Bitter Music volume. So this is perhaps why, and perhaps explains some of the reasons, that when Philip Blackburn's Enclosure 3 and my book, Harry Partch, a Biography, rolled off their respective presses a matter of months apart in 1997 and 98, reviewers began to speak about exploding Partch myths. It was because many of the gaps in our knowledge of Partch could now be filled in. But, as I hope I've shown this afternoon, some mysteries still remain. And let me end then by stating my personal hope that the research into Partch's life, the process of reconstructing Harry, is far from being over now. It's only just begun.